The following is a production of Texas Lutheran University. For more information, please visit tlu.edu.
Good evening. I'm Steve Anderson, Assistant to the President for Administration and Public Affairs here at Texas Lutheran, and I'm also chair of the university's Brown Cultural Enrichment Committee, which is sponsoring tonight's program. On behalf of our president, Stuart Dorsey, and the Brown Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and to thank you for being here. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like for you to please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And while you're doing that, I will let you know that copies of Michele Norris's memoir, The Grace of Silence, will continue to be available for sale in the lobby after the lecture. And Ms. Norris has graciously agreed to sign books in the lobby before she leaves this evening. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture is made possible by Texas Lutheran University's Brown Endowment Fund, which was established by the late Mrs. Jessie Schultz Brown and Dr. Jack H.U. Brown to enrich the arts, sciences, and culture at TLU. The university is grateful to the Browns for their foresight and generosity, and we are pleased to honor them with this program this evening. For many of us, Michele Norris is a regular passenger in our car as we drive home from work or about town on weekday afternoons. As co-host of National Public Radio's longest-running national program, All Things Considered, Ms. Norris helps keep us informed about our complex world and provokes us to think about the world in new and meaningful ways. Before joining NPR in December 2002, Ms. Norris was a correspondent for ABC News. As a contributing correspondent for the Closer Look segments on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, she reported extensively on education, inner-city issues, the nation's drug problem, and poverty. She earned both an Emmy Award and a Peabody Award for her contributions to ABC's coverage of 9/11. And she also has reported for the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times newspapers. In addition to the Emmy and Peabody, Ms. Norris has received numerous awards for her work, including the 2010 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for her and her co-host Steve Inskeep's program, The York Project, Race and the 2008 Vote. In 2009, she was the Journalist of the Year, as named by the National Association of Black Journalists, and that same association honored her with its 2006 Salute to Excellence Award for her coverage of Hurricane Katrina. In 2007, she was honored with Ebony Magazine's 8th Annual Outstanding Women in Marketing and Communications Award, and in 2009 was named one of Essence Magazine's 25 most influential Black Americans. In September 2010, Ms. Norris released her first book, The Grace of Silence, which was named one of the best books of that year by the Christian Science Monitor. Also in 2010, she established the Race Card Project, which is designed to encourage and facilitate open, honest conversation about race in America. And we'll be hearing more about both her life story and the Race Card Project momentarily. Ms. Norris has a very interesting, I think, academic background. She attended the University of Wisconsin, where she majored in electrical engineering. But as she was telling us a little while ago, she had an epiphany somewhere along the way and graduated from the University of Minnesota with a major in journalism. Today, she lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their 2 young children, and she also has a stepson who attends college in California. Please help welcome to the stage Michele Norris.
Steve, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. You know, I listen to that introduction, I think, gal, I'm just a gal that talks on the radio. And when people talk about my work on the radio, they usually talk about my voice, that it is something you hear and that it is usually soothing and comfortable. And I always sort of chuckle when I hear that because at home, as Steve mentioned, I have 2 young children, And my children are always saying to me, Mommy, can we have the radio voice? Because if you have children yourself, you know that you sometimes have to give them something other than the radio voice. And tell them if you clean your room, then you get the radio voice, but until then, you get something else. I'm really honored to be here, blessed, in fact, to be able to share my story with you and hopefully have a conversation this evening here in this room. Because that's really what I enjoy about my work, is that every day I get to have a conversation with listeners that are in their cars and their kitchens and their cubicles at work. The great thing, actually there are many great things about being here. I've met lovely people in the short time that I've been here and fast friends, but being in a room like this and being able to see your faces is meaningful to me, because usually I'm in Studio 2A with Robert or Melissa, imagining people on the other side of the glass, having a conversation, but it feels very much like a one-way conversation. And so it's wonderful to be able to be here tonight to talk to you, although I can't see you all that well because the room is a little bit dark. I'm especially honored that the family members here from our sister station here in San Antonio are in the audience. So knowing that it's Pledge Week, I'm making sure to fly the flag for NPR. I wanted to talk to you tonight, if I could, about my journey through history and my discovery that that I'm a historian, and that in many ways you all are too. That we all can be historians, and in fact we all need to be historians in very important ways. We're on a college campus, and so when we think about history, we usually think about history with a capital H, the stuff that's in textbooks, the stuff that professors pass on to us while wearing tweed blazers with leather patches on their elbows. That's the way that I thought about history, that it was big stuff, important stuff that was learned in buildings with ivy covered, climbing up the walls. And what I discovered in the process of moving from journalist to author, adding that to my portfolio, is that history sometimes has a small h. What I did in the course of writing this book is, I guess I discovered the I in history. I wrote this book it was actually published in 2010. And if you look at the cover of the book, there are 3 words that hang out after the cover: the grace of silence, and then in little teeny letters it says, a family memoir. And whenever I look at that, I feel that there should be a 4th word added there, a little caret with an additional word that would make that read an accidental family memoir, because this wasn't the book that I set out to write. I had no intention of writing memoir. I didn't see myself as a memoirist. I can't even say it correctly. I was intending to write a book about other people. I wanted to write a book in the run-up to and in the wake of the election of Barack Obama. I wanted to write a book about how Americans were talking and thinking about race. You see, in that period, 2007 into 2008, there was a word that we heard a lot. You heard it from us on the radio, you would read it in the newspaper, you would hear it when you flipped on the television, turned on cable: post-racial. Remember that? We don't hear it so much anymore, but it was everywhere for a while. And it suggested that America was moving to this state, perhaps, where race was something we no longer needed to talk about or consider. And I thought that was interesting, because from the place that I sat in Studio 2A at NPR, I thought, well, we're not necessarily moving past this point. It seems like we're moving to a space where people are actually thinking about race and talking about race in really interesting and sometimes very animated ways. And I had wanted to put an ear to that. I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. And I was motivated in part by some work that I did that Steve actually mentioned in conjunction with my colleague Steve Inskeep, who hosts that other show in the morning called Morning Edition. Steve and I worked on a project together in York, Pennsylvania. It was called Race in the 2008 Vote. And what we did is we went to the town of York repeatedly to talk to a small group of voters about their thoughts on the election, but most specifically their thoughts about race and culture and diversity, but really mainly about race. We asked them a series of simple questions, and we had a very interesting conversation. We chose York because it was close to us in Washington, D.C. This was important because Steve and I host 2-hour-long programs, and we try to break away to get there quickly, so it had to be what we call GD, geographically desirable. We had to be able to get there quickly. It was important also because it was hard for Steve and I to find time in our schedule to get any place to talk to a group of people, because I host an afternoon show and he hosts a morning show, which means he essentially lives like a vampire. He goes to work at about 2 o'clock in the morning and leaves at about noon, so we only have a few hours a day where we actually are working on the same clock. So we chose York, Pennsylvania. We worked very hard to put together a diverse group of voters, and then we had to figure out how to get them comfortable, because we figured, well, race is this thing that we know people are talking about, but they're not always comfortable talking about it. So what can we do to create an environment where they might be willing to open up and really have an honest conversation? Steve had this idea that it had to take place in a room that had a hearth. He believed that if people sat next to a roaring fire, that somehow it would warm them up and they would be willing to have this wonderful conversation. And so the producers that were working with us were traveling all over York, Pennsylvania, trying to find a room that was large enough to accommodate the two of us, the producers, and this group of 15 voters, but also had a roaring fireplace. It was very difficult to do, and at one point, late in the process, we were actually thinking about going to Home Depot or Lowe's and just buying one of those fireplaces that we could slap up against the wall and maybe press a button and turn it on. At the last minute, the producers found a suite in an old hotel on the top floor that someone had been living in for many years and had recently vacated. And lo and behold, it had a hearth. It didn't work, we didn't care. It had a hearth and a mantle, and it had a lot of tchotchkes on the mantle, decorative plates and the like, that made it look like it was a space that maybe your Aunt Maybelle had lived there. It fit the bill. That was what Steve wanted. I had one request, and that was if we brought people together, once we brought them together, that we should feed them. That if a conversation began with food, that somehow the carbohydrates might lubricate that conversation and that we'd move to an interesting place. We held a series of these conversations with the voters, and when we got them together, the hearth maybe worked, the food definitely worked. Because once they got together and broke bread together, they made small talk, and you could see them making connections and essentially making friends after a time. And then they got comfortable. They did that thing that we all do after we have a good meal. We knew that we were in the right space when they started to kick off their shoes and loosen their belts and just kind of settle in. And we asked them a series of very simple questions. Do Black Americans make too much of race? Do white Americans underestimate their privilege? At the time, Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side, and we asked the voters in the room, when she talked about Joe Sixpack, what did he look like? Who did you imagine in your mind when you heard that phrase, Joe Sixpack? Was he Latino? Was he South Asian? And yet, within that group of 15 voters, we had someone who was South Asian. He ran a local diner, And he said that every 2 weeks when he made payroll, when he paid the dishwasher and the people who waited on tables and the cooks, and when he finally sat down to pay himself his salary, he would set aside money and go buy a six-pack. And yet, he didn't think that Sarah Palin was talking about him. I don't know how many of you heard those series of conversations when they aired on the radio, but it was really quite something. It was, to us, it seemed like magical radio because we got to that place that you don't often get to when you talk about a difficult subject. People were really honest. They unburdened themselves. They disengaged their filters, and they spoke with great honesty, even if it sometimes made other people in the room or on the other side of the radio uncomfortable. And at the end of that, I thought, wow, if we could do that in that room, it led me to believe that there's this interesting conversation about race in America that maybe we weren't getting to in the studio, that I had to leave the studio and go out to office parks and college campuses and communities and church basements, beauty shops, to actually hear that conversation. That's what I intended to do, to try to hear a conversation in the most private spaces. But something interesting happened when I started to listen carefully to the conversation in the private spaces where I would be around elders in my family. I heard something very interesting, something I'd never heard before. Suddenly, the older people in my family were spilling stories. They were having a very honest conversation. In their case, the filters were disengaging. It was almost as if the older people in my family, older African Americans who remembered a very different America, were suddenly reaching back and touching those memories, and it was as if they suddenly had historic indigestion. And all of these stories started bubbling up and spilling out, and usually over food. It always happened when we sat down to break bread together, they would share these stories. And as they talked about these things, I realized something that was quite humbling, surprising, but very humbling to me, because these are people I thought I knew so well. These are the older members of my family. And as someone who's the journalist in the family, I thought I was the person who sort of was the keeper of the history, the one who could suss out the stories. And I realized that there was so much that I did not know about people that I thought I knew so well. All of a sudden, all of these stories were just served up. My family is African American. And as I said, the elders in my family can remember a very different America. And much of this disinhibition that I was experiencing had much to do with the election that they were experiencing. There are several members of my family that are very conservative. They don't necessarily agree with the politics or the policies of the current president. If they sat down in a room with him, they would likely have a very arch conversation. They would have a lot to say to him, and he would just have to listen. And yet, when they picked up a newspaper and saw a man of color sitting at a very large desk in the Oval Office, something in them shifted. Because that man looked like a member of their family, maybe one of their grandsons, maybe one of their cousins. For family members of mine who were quite enthusiastic about this election, something in them shifted when they walked into a small booth and picked up a number 2 pencil and filled in a circle. Because for them, the idea that a man of color would move with his family into the White House was beyond their imagination, based on the America that they were born into. To think of something like that for them as older African Americans would be like trying to reach out and touch the sun. And yet, this happened right before their eyes. And so that shift led these stories to suddenly spill out. And as I learned more and more, I realized that as interested as I was in other people's stories, I had to learn a bit about my own history. I had to follow these stories where they led me. And in learning about these family stories, I learned something essential about Americans and how sometimes the ordinary American can play an extraordinary role in moving history forward. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read a brief section from the introduction because it will help you understand what this era of this period of astonishment was like for me, and the stories that just kept spilling forward. You see, I've always known that my racial identity has largely been forged by the sum of experiences in my lifetime, and my most formative memories flow through my parents' lives, from their struggles and tribulations, their triumphs and celebrations, their dignity found through a hard day's work, the devotion of our worship, the places we lived, and above all, the constant expectation captured by one word: rise. Rise and shine. Rise to the occasion. Rise above it all, no matter what. Move forward, never backward, always onward and upward. And if you ever feel like you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hold on until you can start climbing again. For all of our lives, we were told, keep your eye on the prize, stay strong, keep committed, focus on the fight for justice and equality, set your sights on excellence and opportunity, do not let up, don't look back, don't slow down, ignore the slights and the slurs that try to keep you from achieving your goals. Always keep the prize in mind, see it, smell it, feel it. Our parents armed us with what they thought we needed: strength, courage, and a touch of indignation, but just a touch. I was shaped by the advice and admonitions that rained down on me. I have always known that. What I did not know until I began this project is that I was also shaped by the weight of my parents' silence. I originally wanted to write about how other people talked about race, but that presumption was swiftly disabused when I learned about secrets in my own family that had purposely been kept from me. And among those secrets was this. As a young man, my father had been shot by a white policeman in Birmingham, Alabama. He never spoke about the incident after leaving Alabama and moving north. He never told even my mother. He took the story to his grave. But my mother, she too was hiding something. My mother never talked about the time her mother spent working as a traveling Aunt Jemima, swooping through small Midwestern towns in a hoop skirt and headscarf to perform pancake-making demonstrations for farm women. The memory had caused her shame, so she'd locked it away. These revelations suggested to me that in certain ways I've never had a full understanding of my parents or the formation of my own racial identity, stories that had been kept from me, stories that were suddenly served up over mashed potatoes or huevos rancheros in one case. Literally. Stories that I couldn't let go of. Those stories got on my back, and that led me down a different road and on a different journey, and led me to become this accidental historian. My family wasn't much happy with that decision. They were very comfortable with me writing about other people, less comfortable writing about my own people. You see, when you write a memoir, you pull everybody into the boat with you, and they don't necessarily want to get in the boat. They didn't buy a ticket for this ride. They're not interested in that. And yet these were stories that I had to track down. I needed to know more once I learned these things. And these stories always seemed to come from my aging uncles. They were usually the ones that were spilling the beans. And in the case of the story involving my grandmother and her work as an itinerant Aunt Jemima, that story came to me from my Uncle Jimmy. And I actually feared for him after he shared the story because I thought my mother was going to snatch him bald-headed. She was very angry. When I asked her about my grandmother's work, she didn't want to talk about it. She would say, talk about it when I'm gone. Now, that's a very difficult thing to hear from a woman who is in her older years, a woman who was at that point approaching 80. and yet I had to figure out how to get her to share her story. I understood why my mother felt a certain amount of shame associated with my grandmother's work. And when I was reading this, I usually try to peek up into the audience when I describe my grandmother's work as an itinerant Aunt Jemima, because the people in the audience sometimes kind of have their faces scrunched up a bit. They're trying to understand what that is, itinerant Aunt Jemima. Well, what it meant was that my grandmother, Ione Brown, would travel to towns throughout the Midwest. I'm from Minnesota. I was raised in Minnesota, south side of Minneapolis. She would travel to Midwestern towns dressed up as Aunt Jemima to do pancake demonstrations. There were an army of women who did this kind of work. There was one woman who was quite prosperous who had the entire state of Texas and part of Oklahoma. In my grandmother's case, she had a 6-state region. She traveled throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas, and Michigan. She did this work in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. She would dress up, roll into town, and show people how to make pancakes using mix. My mother hated this story. She did not like this story. And it's hard for me to talk about shame because it's my grandmother. How can I use the word shame when I'm talking about my grandmother? But yet I understood why my mother had very complicated feelings attached to this, because we're talking about Aunt Jemima. And we're not talking about the Aunt Jemima that you see on the box today. Okay, how many of you use Aunt Jemima pancake mix? And it's okay, we use it in my house. My kids love it. They like the lady that looks like she has her hands on her hip in the Aunt Jemima syrup bottle. So it's not a trick question. But how many of you use Aunt Jemima pancake mix today? Okay, so if you know what Aunt Jemima looks like today, right? She looks like maybe she shops at Dillard's. Yeah? She gets her hair done every Tuesday. Has a nice little wet set going on. Peter Pan collar, she wears pearls, maybe plays canasta on Saturdays, gets up early for church on Sundays. She's got it going on right now. Okay, the Aunt Jemima that I'm talking about when my grandmother was doing this work, it was a different Aunt Jemima. It was before the extreme makeover. The Aunt Jemima of the late 1940s and early 1950s looked like a slave woman. Now, again, I understand why my mother had complicated feelings about this. The NAACP during that period was urging Quaker Oats, the company that at that point owned Aunt Jemima, and was advertising heavily to remove that image from the box. And yet it was hard for me to feel shame, A, because it's my grandmother, but because of something else, because I felt this certain fascination to learn more about her work. Fascination because she was doing this work in the mid-1940s and early 1950s, and everything I learned when I was on a college campus taking women's studies courses led me to believe that women in the late 1940s and early 1950s really didn't travel a whole lot, not by themselves, and black women certainly weren't traveling a whole lot. So I was fascinated by that. But I was also fascinated and a bit perplexed because the image that I have of my grandmother really just didn't comport with the image of Aunt Jemima, at least the old Aunt Jemima. My grandmother, Ione Brown, was a very stylish woman. She was not very tall, but she had a big personality. She was an authoritative figure. She was a community leader. She was always running things. There's a building in the south side of Minneapolis that still bears her name. It's a senior citizen center that she founded. She was always in the paper, getting the keys to the city. She was what you would describe as a committee woman. Okay, now, if you have a committee woman in your life, you know what I'm talking about. Women who tell people what to do, and the only thing you can possibly say in response is, yes, ma'am. Women who are transformed if you give them a clipboard. That was my grandmother. And she was, you wouldn't call her bossy because that sounds a little bit disrespectful, but she really was quite authoritative. And she would dress in such a manner that would lead you to believe that she was someone who was to be obeyed. And this was every day, not just on Sunday when she went to church. If she was going to Kroger's or Red Owl to the grocery store, she would be dressed. If she was going to the beauty shop, she would be dressed. If she was in her house, she would still be dressed. She would just be dressed with a really nice apron that matched whatever she was wearing, that she usually made. And they were those pinafore aprons that had fancy lace pockets and things like that. And she dressed in the way that women dressed at the time, in a way that was very carefully coordinated, and it almost looked, as a kid, like she was wearing the adult version of Garanimals, because everything matched. So if it was a light blue day, everything from head to toe was sort of light blue. If it was a lavender day, the suit was light blue, and the brooch that she wore was light blue, and the scarf that she would attach to her little very compact, triangular-shaped pocketbook would also be of the same hue. That's the woman that I remembered from my youth. And when I learned this story, I had to imagine a very different version of my grandmother. I had to imagine her not wearing one of these stylish outfits and not with one of these beautiful silk scarves tied beneath her chin. I had to imagine her instead with a different kind of headdress. I had to imagine her with a scarf that was pulled from the back of her head and pulled forward. It certainly wouldn't be silk. You might not even call it a scarf. You might call it a kerchief, do-rag. I had to imagine her getting dressed to do these pancake demonstrations and stepping 1 foot at a time into a hoop skirt and then tying a gingham apron around her waist, usually padding herself because she wasn't as large, didn't have as much girth as the woman on the pancake box in the 1940s and 1950s had. I had to imagine this woman who had so much pride that almost bordered on vanity, getting into this outfit. Now, I learned of this after she died, so I never had a chance to talk to her about this. I have no idea what kind of hard bargain she made with herself when she stepped into that costume. But because I'm a journalist, I knew how to dig. And because I was lucky, I found newspaper articles describing her work, because when she showed up in these towns, it was like a celebrity was coming to town. Under the headline, Aunt Jemima's coming to town, there'd be her picture, and she would describe her work. And in talking to that reporter, it was almost as if she was talking to me through the years. And I learned about how she did this work. I learned that when she would go into these small towns, she would do these pancake demonstrations, usually surrounded by a large group of people. And before I go on, I have to just stop and say, you might be wondering, how hard is it to make pancakes? What was it that she was doing in these demonstrations? I mean, don't you just add water and stir? That's true, you do. But remember where we were in the timeline. It was the late 1940s and early 1950s. Convenience cooking was new. So her job was to actually go into these small towns and convince women, usually farm women, to dispose of cooking their pancakes from scratch and instead use this convenient box mix. That was her job. And she was also doing a little bit of reconnaissance along the way. If you go to the store now, if you use Aunt Jemima pancake mix, those of you that rose your hands, you notice that there's two versions, right? Regular and complete. Well, part of that was based on the reconnaissance that these itinerant Aunt Jemimas did, because they realized when they went into the communities that the farm women didn't want to just give up the entire process of cooking. They wanted to participate. So now you can buy the regular mix, or you can buy the version of the mix where you just add water, or you can buy the other version where you participate by breaking an egg. So when she went into these towns, she described to this reporter how she would do her work, and she said that she would focus on young people in these small towns because she knew she was going into small towns and encountering people that had probably never seen a Negro woman before. And so she focused on children because she thought if they left with a favorable impression of her pancake demonstration, that in some small way that might push society forward. She said that she would sing gospel songs when she flipped her pancakes because she wanted people to know that she was a woman of God. That was important to her. And she said that she was very careful about the way she spoke, that she would use a particular kind of diction. Remember that thing I described about something shifting? Well, when I discovered that, something shifted in me. Because my grandmother was a real stickler for diction. She had a very clipped way of speaking. She spoke with a Minnesota accent. She was born and raised in Minnesota, in a small town in Minnesota. Hers was the only black family in a little town called Alexandria, smack in the center of the state. And she had a very specific way of speaking, though, such that you heard every single consonant when she spoke, particularly when she was upset. And so when we were kids, and we were, in the 1970s with our big afros and our big bell bottoms, and we were thinking we were hip and cool, and we were talking about how we were fixing to do something or thinking about doing something, she would say, "Excuse me, this is Minnesota, and it's very cold outside. Mr. G is standing outside that door. Maybe you want to invite him inside so he can attach himself to the rest of your words so you could talk about how you are thinking about doing something." She was forever fussing at us about lifting up our diction when we would be at her house, often early on Saturday mornings, and ironically often eating pancakes, because she always made big bunches of pancakes for the cousins. She said that she would use this careful diction for a reason, and the more digging I did, I realized how important and how actually slightly subversive that was. Because in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, Aunt Jemima was one of the biggest advertisers in America. You could not pick up a magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, Women's Day, without seeing an ad for Aunt Jemima Pancake Mix. And in those ads, the woman that you would encounter would speak like someone who did not have much education. And they would spell out her language phonetically to let you know that she was not a woman who was well educated. "Lawsy, lawsy, I sure do serve some tantalizing pancakes," is the way this would read. These ads were huge. They covered often 2 pages on the inside of a magazine. They described her life, totally fictional life that she led on Colonel Higbee's plantation, where people were forever trying to get her to give up her pancake recipe. And my grandmother was supposed to use this language when she would go out into the world, and what I learned is that she and many of the other women who did this work refused to do it. They would speak as if they had education, because most of them did. That's why they were recruited to do this work. I realized that my grandmother saw this as an opportunity to lift herself up with income, but also to lift her people up. And in that sense, she was serving almost like a representative, an ambassador. I guess the kids today would call it representing. That's what she was doing. And when I learned of this, I was able to take that back to my family members who didn't much like talking about this period in her life when she did this work. They'd never been out on the road with her. They weren't interested in that. And I understood why they weren't interested in that. But I also understood the power of going and finding out a little bit about her work and realizing that there was something there that no one really knew, that there was great honor in what she was doing. There was no shame in taking a job that could have been demeaning and using that job to lift yourself up. It was one of the examples of how I discovered the power of history and what that really meant to us as a family, and how every little story opened the door a little bit wider, a little bit wider, a little bit wider. In my case and in my family, I realized that I inherited a much more complicated family legacy, a family racial legacy than I had ever known. And as difficult as these stories were, I realized that there was great value in tracking them down, in trying to get the family members to share those stories with me, because they painted a picture of who we are as a people, and they gave me something now that I can give my own children. I realized in the writing of this book and in talking to readers who read the book and often share their own stories, that my story was individual but also universal, that so many of us have stories in our families that we just don't talk about. America is a country filled with people who often came from other places and sort of reinvented themselves when they got here to become whatever their idea of being more American was. And often that meant taking the difficult stories and locking them away and not necessarily sharing them with the next generation. That's certainly what happened in my family with my grandmother's work and with my father's shooting. My father was wounded. If you read the book, you'll learn more about it, but he was wounded in an altercation with a police officer who tried to prevent him from entering a building in Birmingham, a building where veterans were gathering in the evening hours to learn as much as they could about the Constitution. The reason they were trying to learn as much as they could about the Constitution is they were veterans and they wanted to learn as much about the Constitution because if they wanted to try to register to vote, that would be required of them. Alabama had just passed an amendment in response to a Supreme Court case where all white primaries were outlawed. It was actually a case here in Texas, Smith v. Allwright, but it affected states throughout the South that held all white primaries, and it meant that if people of color could register in large numbers, it might change the political calculus throughout the South. And in Alabama, they responded to that with something called the Boswell Amendment, and that held that anyone who wanted to register would have to prove that they understood and could interpret any portion of the Constitution that the registrar pointed to. Now, that thing that I told you about, that shift, there it is again. My father carried a copy of the Constitution in his back pocket all of his life. All of his life. He knew the Constitution cold. He would quiz my sisters on it all the time. If he had lived long enough to witness the House of Representatives in the historic reading of the Constitution, start to finish, he probably would have been walking around the house with his gold-toe slippers and his favorite blue postal cardigan, reciting it right along with him. That evening, it was February 7th, 1946, that he was trying to enter that building. A police officer tried to stop him, and he asserted his right to enter a public building, and a scuffle ensued, and a bullet was discharged, and it wounded him. It wound up strafing the side of his leg. Oh, there's that thing, that shift again. Because my father, all his life, walked with a very particular gait. He had 5 brothers. They're all from Birmingham, Alabama, and his 5 extremely handsome men, extremely handsome black men. If you buy the book, you'll see their picture in here. They all had a little something, something in their walk. They walked, there is a certain way that black men can walk where they add just a little something. You know what I'm talking about? If you don't, let me help you out. If you think about President Obama when he walks up to the podium, there's just a little something extra there. You know what I'm talking about? If you can't picture that, then think about Denzel Washington. The way one leg just lands a little bit later than the other one. You know what I'm talking about. In my father's case, there was just a little bit something extra. Little bit. It wasn't, you wouldn't call it a limp, but it was just a little bit something extra. And it turned out that it was a remnant of this wound that he never talked about. He never even told my mother in all the years of marriage and all the years of intimacy that was never shared. He kept it to himself. I realized in doing research for the book how fortunate he was in that this was only a superficial wound, truly fortunate, because during that period in 1946, in that first 6 weeks where black veterans were streaming back to the country and to Birmingham in particular in very large numbers, this voter registration drive was causing quite a bit of trouble. I learned that half a dozen returning black veterans were reportedly shot and killed by police officers in the first 6 weeks of 1946. My father's wounding fell within that period. There was a Marine who was shot and killed while still wearing his uniform 2 days after my father was wounded. A week after my father was wounded, there was a serviceman that was blinded in South Carolina. He was honorably discharged from Fort Gordon in Georgia. He was on his way to North Carolina. While they were passing through South Carolina, he told a bus driver that he needed to make water, and the bus driver didn't like his tone, so he called ahead, and someone was waiting for the bus when it pulled ahead. He radioed ahead, and the police officers pulled someone named Isaac Woodard, who was still wearing his military uniform at that point, into an alley and beat him such that he was left blinded. His name was Isaac Woodard. Now, I'm sorry to give you a pop quiz, but we are on a college campus, so I'm going to take the liberty to do that. How many of you have heard of the name Isaac Woodard? Isaac Woodard. I ask this all the time, and usually no more than 2 or 3 people raise their hands. Isaac Woodard's case was widely reported on. He was blinded. Case was adjudicated in Aiken, South Carolina. He was blinded in Batesburg, and it was big news. It was covered in a series of blistering radio editorials by Orson Welles. If you listened on Sunday nights in his radio program, you would hear him repeatedly take up this case. It was covered by the New York Times, by the International Herald Tribune. It was international news. It was the case that led Harry Truman to take the decisive steps to integrate the armed forces after much deliberation. Harry Truman was so troubled that this could happen to a serviceman while he was still wearing his uniform, that was that case that led him to finally issue that executive order. Harry Truman wrote letters about Isaac Woodard to his family members, to several of his friends. This is all available for anyone to read at the Truman Library, and yet most of us don't know much about Isaac Woodard for the same reasons that I don't know much about my father's case. Difficult history that we just stopped talking about. Like my grandmother, I never had a chance to talk to my father about this case because he took it to his grave and I never could ask him questions about it. But I did talk to several other veterans. And to a person, they never talked about their mistreatment in the segregated armed forces, and they never talked about their disappointment and in many cases their bitterness at coming back to a country that they loved but did not love them back. They never talked much about their bitterness at having fought for democracy overseas in World War II, but being denied the right to participate in democracy close to home. When I worked on this book, people always asked me, "You must have been so angry when you learned about these stories." And I surprised even myself because I didn't land at a place called anger. I was actually in a state of wonder, because we live in a society today where we complain so much. If you go to the local Starbucks and someone gets your half-calf latte wrong, you might tweet about it, put it on your Facebook page. And yet I realized that I was raised by a man and surrounded by so many that had real reasons to be angry. Angry at America, angry at the way they were treated, angry at their lot at life. And yet I realized that one of the reasons they kept those stories to themselves was, yes, it was difficult to look back. Yes, it was painful to dwell on some of these things. But one of the biggest reasons that I was told by these veterans that they didn't talk about this is they had the next generation in mind, my generation. Oh, there's that thing shifting again. Because you realize that that is such an incredible act of grace. That's why I use the word grace in the title of the book, the grace of silence. The decision not to feed the next generation a steady diet of anger, but instead give them all of your ambitions. Instead, trying to show America what it could be by showing America what they could be, by doing their best in everything. Oh, and mine were they all type A. My dad was type A, his brothers were type A, and most of the veterans that I tracked down and talked to, you know them when you see them. Their pants are creased so sharp that you could cut your finger. They wear hats, they still wear hats. Hats that they keep on blocks so they hang just right on their head. Their cars are maintained so beautifully that if you had to, you could apply eyeliner in the chrome. My father would cut his lawn so that it looked like he got on his hands and knees and did it with shears, always trying to show people that he belonged, that he was worthy of their respect, but yet never passing on that anger to the next generation. Because I think, like so many other people who've come to America through difficult circumstances, they think about the next generation and they think, I want them to soar. And if I want them to soar, I cannot put rocks in their pockets. But you may ask, if you benefited from the grace of silence, you just wrote a memoir. That means you just told your own children about this. You put a boulder in their pocket, but I've thought about this. You see, I think it's true that you don't want to weigh down young people if you want them to soar, but it's okay to put pebbles in their pocket, or maybe even pearls of wisdom, so that they are grounded, so that they understand where they came from. You understand where you're going much more clearly if you have a strong sense of where you've come from. And this is a special appeal to the young people here in this room and in this campus. When you are ever in the vicinity of the older people in your families, take every advantage to listen to their stories. I know you might want to pick up your device, your smartphone, your PSA or whatever, put it down, put it on the table, and turn on record and listen to their stories. It's the one thing that I so regret that I did not do when my father walked this earth. I work on the radio. I swim in audio all day long. I have, through this book, been able to give my children a sense of our family's history, and it is such an incredible gift, but the one thing I cannot give them is the gift of listening to their grandfather's voice. Because I never recorded it. Shame on me. Your history is part of your wealth. Before people measured their wealth in terms of bank accounts and housing values, in ancient times, your history was part of your wealth. If you had an interesting story to tell, you were deemed to be quite affluent. And that story was interesting if there were peaks and valleys, not if the sun was shining all the time. So whenever you have the opportunity, capture that story. Listen to the people around you who can share that story about your family, about your community. Find the eye in history. I can tell you there's grace in silence, but there's so much power in knowing something about where you came from. You have a special opportunity to do that soon. We're coming up on the holiday season, and if you listen to that other show in the morning edition, you know that there's something called StoryCorps that airs every Friday. And the creator of StoryCorps is a wonderful fellow named Dave Isay. And Dave Isay is a rather bold young man, not just because he founded StoryCorps, but because he decided that he was going to create his own holiday. That takes a lot of confidence to do that, to say, I have an idea for a national holiday, and I'm just going to name it and frame it and create it. But he did it, and it's a good idea. He calls the Friday after Thanksgiving the National Day of Listening. And on the Friday after Thanksgiving, when you're with your family and you're usually feeling really good because you've loaded up on all that turkey and all that stuffing, he suggests that you take a little bit of time to talk to each other about history, and if you can, record it. If you must go to the mall, God bless you. I hope you have a great time. But I can tell you, if you do take the time to capture a little bit of family history, it will be worth more than anything you could possibly find at the mall or at the local Walmart. In this journey, I've learned a lot about listening to family members, but listening in general. When I wrote this book, I knew that I would be speaking to audiences like this and talking about race. And I knew enough to know that race can be an uncomfortable subject. And I was nervous about that. I will admit that. So nervous that I thought I had to do something to try to move that conversation along, to make people feel a little more comfortable. And so what I did is I decided to quite literally play the race card. When you walked into the room, you were probably handed a card. Did you get those when you walked in? And you probably thought, what is this? Is this direct mail? What does she want from me? Well, I thought that I might be able to move the conversation along if I invited people to participate in a little exercise. And the exercise went like this. I asked people to think about the word race, a little word association. What comes to your mind? Think about your observations, your experiences, your triumphs, your laments, anything you might think about, but there are rules. You only get one sentence, and the sentence can only have 6 words. So your thoughts about race distilled to one sentence with 6 words. I printed up about 200 of these cards, and I distributed them to the first few stops on my book tour after the book was published, and I held my breath to see if anyone would take the bait. And it turned out about 30% of the people actually mailed them back. They filled out their one-word sentences. Sometimes they were actually 10 words, but they'd put parentheses around them, or they'd try to figure out how to make it seem like just 6 words. But they all did it. And they affixed postage, and they sent them to me, so I printed more, and I printed more, and I started distributing them wherever I went. And then thanks to Facebook and Twitter, it really took off. And people started sending them in from all over the place, and not just around this country, but they started to come in from distant places in the globe, from Abu Dhabi and Brisbane and Brussels and Finland. How they heard about the Race Card Project, I have no idea. But it turned out that we talk about race, but in other places it's not about race. It's about tribalism, or it's about religion, but there's often some conversation that has to do with the other. And this process has been fabulously interesting for me, because what it's done is taken me full circle. Remember, originally I wanted to eavesdrop on that private conversation about race, and now it quite literally comes in over the transom, in 6-word spurts, when people send me their stories. He shot at us but missed. Doesn't that make you want to know more? Who was he? Why did he shoot? What happened when he missed? And how is it that you've been carrying this around with you all these years? Someone handed me a card in Raleigh-Durham. He was an older man, and he didn't want to sign his card. I do ask people to sign it if they would, give me their name and their contact information, because now I cycle back and do recorded oral histories often. He did not want to sign his. He was very emotional when he gave me his card. His 6 words were, "Race is throwing rocks at kids." Race is throwing rocks at kids. He was an older man. I'm not always good at guessing age, but he looked to be maybe in his 70s or 80s, and he was very emotional. I was signing books, and so I wasn't able to follow him, but before he left, even though he didn't give me his name, he told me briefly the story behind his 6 words, and he said that in the Raleigh-Durham area, when integration came to Raleigh-Durham, people didn't think it was a good idea. A lot of people didn't think it was a good idea, and he was one of them. He said that people tried to block the schoolhouse doors to prevent children of color from entering previously all-white schools, and he was one of them. And he said that sometimes people threw things at school children who were trying to cross the color line, and he was one of them. He said that they threw vegetables, cabbages, tomatoes, but they also threw bricks and rocks, and he threw those too, and he knows he made contact. So through great emotion, he explained that when he travels around the Raleigh-Durham area, if he's going to the hardware store or the library or the grocery store, if he sees an African-American man or woman of a similar age, he said he always looks at their forehead, because after all this time, he's looking for a scar. But he's also, he said, looking for a chance to say, after all these years, I'm sorry. He'd never talked about this. He said he'd never shared it with anyone. He's in a room where the only other person he knows is the person he came with that night, and yet he shared that story. And I was signing books, so I couldn't follow him, but when he left, there were 2 women, actually, that were following behind him, and they went and sat with him because he really was shaken when he shared his card. And I sat there and I thought, if not for this crazy exercise, he might not have shared that, and they might not ever be engaged in that conversation. It showed me, once again, the value in, yes, looking back at history, that's sometimes difficult, but really the value in listening to each other. To give you a sense of the archive of stories and experiences that have come in, I could tell you a series of stories, but instead I'm going to do something that Anna Devere Smith suggested that I do. Do you know who Anna Devere Smith is? The performance artist. She did Fires in the Mirror and Fire Next Time, Let Me Down Easy. She's been on Broadway. If you watch TV, do you watch Nurse Jackie? She plays the administrator, the one that you hope you never run into. She is a wonderful artist, monologuist, and she follows the Race Car Project on the website, and she says, it seems like a conversation, like they're actually people talking to each other, even though they're coming in these 6-word essays from all over the place. And so she said, grab a few of them and read them out loud, and I think that they really will sound like a conversation. So I just want to share a few with you tonight if I can. And remember that as I read these tether people from all over the country, all walks of life, all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. They're sometimes using their keyboards, they're sometimes sending these in actual postcards, sometimes sending them via Twitter or Facebook. But in each case expressing themselves in 6 words, and in doing so often saying things they'd never utter in polite conversation. So this is what race sounds like if you only get 6 words to express it. It matters, like it or not, much ado about nothing. We are still a racist society. Race does not exist by itself. Race is everything, but it's nothing. Today's soft segregation harms everyone. Black wears me wherever I go. I admit to unconscious racial bias. Does not define who I am. A costume mistaken for an actor. Who I am, who I am not. Racism is a shackle. I broke mine. Sometimes racism is self-imposed. That was submitted by someone you hear on the radio all the time. Step on backs to raise yourself, still working harder than others are. The point of it all, power. Get your feet off our necks. Blacks complain constantly despite obvious progress. But I voted for Barack Obama. Colors run together, why can't people? I hear my grandfather's hateful words. White man vilified, what I do. Racism I inherited breaks my heart. This is from an 8-year-old. Think Dr. Seuss and the Sneetches. Sometimes when people send them in, you see their thought process. Someone wrote race to the border and then crossed that out and then wrote, no, make that race is the border. Diversity don't count if it's white. Pay no attention to my packaging. I am still not from Vietnam. Please stop saying I am articulate. See me, see black, see nothing. I am fortunate to be Caucasian. Easy to assume I'm guilty. My great-great-grandfather owned slaves. Would Martin Luther King support gay rights? Born, colored, children, African American, progress, and then that person wrote several question marks. A terrible, unnecessary barrier against love. Reason I ended a sweet relationship. Black woman, white man, golden children. I will not ruin your bloodline. Korean marries Italian in Chinese garden. Obama is mixed, black and white. The hybrid shall inherit the earth. My son is not half, he's double. Someone wrote, it all goes downhill after these 6 words. I am not a racist, but. Let's all hit the reset button. Every now and then I remember, grandparents passed, new tree, no roots. Civility heals wounds from the past. Still the elephant in the room. What a tangled web we wove. Rebecca, black maid, taught me love. Didn't sound Chinese on the phone. He said they always get away. I am glad they fear me. Minority obsession and majority guilt trip. Tonight, let's all walk with our TVs. That I didn't understand. I actually had to write him back and ask him to explain that. And here's his explanation. He said, if you own a television, take it, tuck it under your arm, and walk through your neighborhood at dusk, and you will learn something essential about yourself and your neighborhood. That was his explanation. Purses held tighter when I approach. My mixed background means white enough. Sometimes I'm angry at white people. No one is born a racist. Sad I learn, sad and hopeful. What if the world were colorblind? Colorblindness is not goal. Celebrate colors. Let us all live sweetly together, which, if you listen carefully, that's actually, I believe, the title of a hymn. Start with kids and mix well. Skin color is God's gift wrapping. Our untold stories keep us separate. And I've received more than 10,000 of these submissions that I've archived. I have several thousand that I have not yet archived. But of all of them that I've received, this is my all-time favorite. Underneath, we all taste like chicken. Which kind of says it all. I told you that I learned a little bit about history and a lot about the importance of capturing history and the reality that we all can be historians, but I learned something else, and perhaps this is the most important lesson, and I hope that the young people in this room in particular take this to heart, because we're counting on you to help lead us forward in this most difficult subject, to exercise courage and to exercise candor, and to stay at the table sometimes, even when the conversation gets difficult. And listening is such an important part of that, and that really is the most important lesson throughout this journey for me. People know me from the radio, and they think that the most important thing that I do is talk on the radio. The most important thing I do is listen. I have never learned anything essential while I have been talking. I learn when I stop talking and when I listen carefully. And it's been an honor to be with you tonight and to have you listen to me, but I hope I have left enough time so that I can also listen to a few of your questions. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. That's a welcome the size of Texas there.
There are mics at the end of these two aisles here in the center, and so if you have a question for Ms. Norris, please come forward and ask your question. And we have just a few minutes for questions, so please keep your questions brief.
Or if there are no questions, we can retire. But here comes one.
Here comes one.
Well, welcome to Texas.
Thank you.
And when LBJ passed the Civil Rights Bill, he felt like the South was going to be lost, the Democratic Party was going to be lost. And I don't remember, I thought it was 40 years, but, you know, it's still, I feel like, is lost. Do you have any hope that, you know, the race issue will not become such an issue in the South in the future?
You know, one of the things I've learned is that people associate race with the South. Race is something that is a often thorny and frequently prickly issue, not just in the South. And the irony is that sometimes people in the South deal more frontally with race than in other parts of the country. That has been, you know, my experience both in doing research and in traveling around the country talking. I have great hope that we will continue to move forward. And my 6 words are still more work to do. Because as much progress as we've made, we still do have work to do to understand each other and to keep at it, you know, to keep listening to each other. And to remember that there might not be an end point. I mean, it goes back to that word post-racial, that we reach a point where everything was done and we no longer had to talk about race. I hope we get to the point where we reach, where we become a post-racism, where we can talk about post-racism, which is very different than post-race. Because if you're talking about post-race, you're talking about this idea that maybe everything is rendered in shades of gray, which doesn't sound particularly interesting to me. If you think about the diversity in this country, it's actually one of our strengths. And if you think about the evolution in this country, it certainly is one of our strengths and something that, as a country, we can be very proud of. As I said, we have a long way to go, but we're a young country. And if you think about how far we've come as a country in a very short period of time, it's easy to lose sight of that and to take that for granted, but it's also easy to forget that we have to keep at it and that it's not always going to be easy, but it's worth the effort. Thank you. If you have never heard the tapes, by the way, of LBJ, which they just released another big batch of them when he was talking with Dr. King in the run-up to the passage, it's very interesting, and all of it's available online now.
What would you distinguish between a pebble that would help somebody and a rock that would weigh them down? How would you distinguish them?
Well, part of it is based on, I think of my own kids. I have no idea how old you are.
I'm 18.
Okay, you're 18. I think about my kids who are younger than you, and I think that as they get older, those pebbles can get a little bit bigger, and the things I tell them can be a little bit more expansive. But a big difference between a pebble and a rock in terms of sharing something is sharing something without then having the ability to talk about it. You know, to put something on the table that's difficult without being able to actually talk about what it meant, or to be able to explore that. And that's hard. And when you talk about family history, this is tough stuff, and you might not always get it in one go-round sometimes. And, you know, it's exhausting to talk about it. I know for me, it took many, 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 many sit-downs to get people to really open that up. That to me would be a big example, but it's also different person to person, and you sort of know individually what you can handle, and if you sit down with a family member, you sort of know when you're crossing the line and being disrespectful and when you're being curious, because sometimes it is a fine line there. But I hope I've answered your question. I would say this, that if you are trying to get people in your family to talk to you, or really anyone, I wish I could have food at all my interviews, because somehow it really does make a difference. And I do know in capturing family history, dessert, you know, if they, pecan pie, lemon meringue pie, it helps. Thank you. Well, if that's it, we can also say good night unless there's anybody.
If we have
Oh.
one more coming here.
Are you going to share your 6 words? You have your card in your hand.
As somebody who does radio for a living as well, I just wanted to
You should
know.
introduce yourself, because people actually hear you on the radio.
I'm
so-
Ryan Lloyd from Texas Public Radio, so really appreciate Michele Norris being here. And a TLU graduate as well. But I found it extremely difficult because I thought it would be a shame to not record my family and to have their thoughts be on tape. So I tried that. But I still found it very difficult because when I'm talking to my family, it's personal.
Yeah.
What tools would you recommend that you could talk to your own family about, that you can go out and talk to strangers about, to try to get them to share more with, you know, because by the time I've recorded, we've already had dinner and dessert,
Right.
and we're laughing, but there's still that barrier there.
You know, I found that, I'm glad you asked this question, because I struggled with that, and they didn't like being interviewed. They're like, I'm not one of your subjects, okay? I'm not one of the people in the studio, but stop interviewing me. And I realized that I had to go in the side door, that if I sat down and had like a direct interview with them, they didn't much like that. They called it going all BBC on them, that, you know, they really, they did not appreciate it. But if I could get them to talk by asking them a series of questions about their life, which are the kind of questions that we ask in the studio. My warm-up, I don't know, what's your warm-up question when someone comes in the studio?
Can you spell your name?
Yeah, I have a great one. I always ask for them to tell me about their summer job, because it just takes them back. People just remember their best selves when they go back and remember when they sold, you know, soda at the ballpark or worked at a car wash or something. But what I did with family members, I would say, what would you do for fun on a Saturday night? What did your mom's kitchen smell like? You know, what sports team did you root for? You know, when you would go out and buy like fancy shoes, did you order them, or did you? So I had to get them to kind of go back to their life and get them in a moment of nostalgia, and then when they were there, then I could sort of then start to ask questions. But I couldn't come in sort of frontally with the questions that I wanted to ask. They had to be sort of deeper within a conversation that was more about history. The other thing that I did is I used my kids. I mean, it just works. You know, if you, are trying to get family history, for the students here, you will be able to get your grandparents to talk to you in ways that your parents can't. You just will. If you have kids that you can use, great. If don't, borrow some. Get some from someone else's. Because my mom would not talk to me, but she would talk to my daughter. And the other thing is, kids have this, and even adult kids have. You can get away with things that we can't. You can ask, well, why would you do that? If I ask why would you go to your room? Even at this advanced age, I would still be dismissed. So they can just be a little bit bold in the questions, and for some reason it's easier. It just skips generationally. So that would be the other thing. And then again, I'll say it one more time: food. Thank you for coming this evening.
Students at TLU engage in high-impact educational experiences that include civic engagement, aesthetic expression, critical thinking, and a focus on intercultural knowledge in a community that welcomes the interplay of faith and reason.